and welcome once again to Unstoppable Mindset. We get to meet every so often and chat, and we get to have a number of people come on the podcast who have interesting stories to tell. And it is no different today. We get to talk with Dr. Alessandra Wal, and she is a psychologist. Am I saying that right? Yes.
Yeah.
A psychologist to the founder and CEO of Noteworthy, and we'll get to that. But Alessandra, and do you go by Alessandra or anything else?
No, full name. If we're gonna do
Alessandra.
Alessandra, it is. Yep.
Perfect. So, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're here.
I am very glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be here. Well, let's start talking about maybe a little bit of the earlier Alessandra, growing up and all that sort of stuff. That's always fun to do that.
Who doesn't love waxing poetic about their childhood?
There you go. So wax poetic as long and as much as you wish.
Let's see. Most important things about most interesting things.
Or unimportant, either way.
So things you can't hear when I speak anymore. Although somebody the other day at the airport said I had an accent, and I'm like, an accent? I have an accent? I don't hear it. But if you say so, I grew up and I was born in Iran, moved to Kuwait, moved to Saudi Arabia, moved from there to France, which is where my mom was born and raised, and lived there until I was 18. And I didn't move to the States until I was 18. My father is from Kansas. A lot less traveling for him, but apparently I still have an accent. But the person in the airport was adamant it was not a European accent. She said maybe Midwestern, and I'm like, there's really just no chance of that, based at least geographically on where I've lived in the world.
Interesting. Well, how long were you in Iran and Kuwait
The
and so
first
on?
7 years of my life, my parents spent a total of 10 years in the Middle East.
Okay.
I got to spend the first 7 years of my life, and then moved to France in what was at the time right outside of Paris, which is in one of the coldest winters they'd ever had. That was quite a shock making the move, but not too uncommon. We'd spent a few Christmases in Goodland, Kansas, and it snows a good deal there, or it did.
Yeah. So what were your parents doing in the Middle East? What was work or whatever, I assume?
For my dad, yes. My mom didn't work. Couldn't in some of the places we lived,
Yeah.
but my father was an engineer.
Oh,
So all the things that engineer and electronics, so all the things that engineers and electronics do or did at the time. This is the late 70s, early 80s in the Middle East, and then just made interesting choices. He's a man who was very bold with his choices from life, given that he was born in 1928 in the Dust Bowl, and those weren't necessarily typical choices for his background.
I had friends. He's passed away now, and my wife actually knew them first and introduced me. But he worked for Hughes, and they spent several years in the late 70s in Iran, and actually were there when the Shah was overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a major challenge to get her and their cats out, and then he got out as well. But they made it happen. But it was a definite tense time all the way around.
It was. My father worked for Hughes too, but not by the time he moved to Iran. And we left right before the Shah fell. But
Yeah.
both my parents learned Farsi. I had siblings who my brother spoke 4 languages by the time he was 5 from traveling: French and English, Italian because they were living in Rome before, and my mom is a first generation French of Italian descent. And then Farsi. They all spoke Farsi.
So, what do you remember about living in the Middle East, and what was it like as a child, kind of growing up there?
I have very fond memories, and I mean, for a variety of reasons. I remember the kindness of people and how
Mm-hmm.
welcoming most people were. I remember mean, depending on what years, there were times where we lived in compounds which with all expats and all foreigners, right? And those experiences were fun, but very different, very Western. But I also remember sitting outside a house in Kuwait with the neighbors right around Ramadan and watching them, butcher chickens to
Mm.
cook. Um I tell people in the States we don't think about like, but when I hear the call to prayer, the Muslim call to prayer, I have very fond memories in the same way that when I hear church bells and
Yeah.
doves, that was my recollection for moving in France, right? Is hearing church bells and doves on a regular basis. Like they're fond memories. Like some people might, have a smell that brings them back to childhood. And I had a brother who would wear navy blue corduroy pants in the desert, which is also very interesting to me. So it speaks, we talk about being adaptable, and it speaks to human adaptability.
Yeah. It must have been wearing corduroy pants and so on. It must have been pretty hot over there.
It was pretty hot. I
Mm.
would not strangely, well, not strangely. I didn't start talking in Fahrenheit until I moved to the States, and then the
Yeah.
temperatures never got that bad. But my understanding is it's at least 40 degrees
Celsius.
Celsius,
Yeah.
if not more, and humid, apparently very humid certain times of years. But again, like for my brother, he was in the Middle East from the time he was 2 or 3 until 13. He spent the full 10 years of his life there. So really, it's this bouncing around from country to country, bouncing around from culture to culture, having to learn, having to integrate, not having to in this case, like getting this opportunity to develop richness in your practices from living in so many places and meeting so many different people. That for me, those are part of the reasons why all of that is so fond.
Yeah.
And moved later on both to, like, my first friends in France they were mixes, right? They were like, my best friend was, his mom was British and his dad was French, and my other best friend, her parents were on the dad's side, he was a first generation French of Italian parents. Mom was all French. But same thing in college. When I moved, my first friends were all people who had multicultural backgrounds because there was an ease of fitting in.
It certainly must seem a lot different now over there as opposed to what it was when you were living there.
I am told it is very different. I know that for the Middle East, for Iran specifically, my mother loved it. She loved the language, she loved the culture. Um, uh, had wanted to go back, but every time we've spoken to people who stayed or who had to leave and who came back, they talked about how jarring the difference is. As for the
Mm.
Middle East, I am still looking for opportunities. I am crossing my fingers for opportunities actually to go speak in the Middle East. So if anybody's listening and needs a speaker, I'm just going to throw that out there. And I keep on telling my mom, the second I get an opportunity, I'll invite her to come with me.
I spent time this past August 2023, at Accessibi in Tel Aviv. This is the
Mhm.
first time I'd been to Israel. And we also then went to Jerusalem. So we went through the West Bank and into Jerusalem. I very much enjoyed it. It is so sad as to what's occurring there now. And it's the usual thing that so often politicians and others just don't tend to listen to others. And it certainly makes it a lot more difficult to try to create some sort of meaningful and peaceful relationships, doesn't it?
Definitely, right? I mean, that's the challenge of leadership. Ultimately, it's like, can you rise to a position where you have the privilege and therefore the responsibility of leading well and still stay in touch with the people you're supposed to be leading? I was thinking about the word the other day, actually just this weekend, talking to my husband about a civil servant, which is ultimately what politicians are supposed to be. They're supposed to
Right.
be civil servants
Hello,
to the
hello.
people. Um, and whether it's politics or the corporate world, I just think that it's very easy to forget that to quote Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility.
Mm-hmm. It is very true, and the problem is it's so easy to, and we seem to easily forget all of that, and we forget that leaders really are supposed to be servants. They're supposed to guide, and they're supposed to help people vision and make the vision happen, but not dictate. And that's just not what goes on, is it?
Nope, not anymore. Well,
It's
I
too
mean,
bad.
realistically, I say not anymore. I think we
Not
can go
mostly.
to many points in history where that wasn't the case either. We had this
Mm-hmm.
brief period where things looked that way.
Yeah. So when you came to the US
Mm-hmm.
at 18, that must have been a major culture shock compared to what you had experienced in Europe and the Middle East.
It was. I wasn't expecting it. My father, as I said, was actually born in Nebraska, grew up in Kansas. We would come back to the States to visit my cousins and aunts and uncles who had, for the most part, migrated to California and Los Angeles and like the golden age of Los Angeles. So my assumption was that I would walk in and I would fit in because in France I was, here's my friend, she's American, right? That's how I was introduced very often. But coming to the States, there was a massive culture shock, and one that I don't think a lot of people realize, because if people look at me, I look the part. I'm, white, I'm light-eyed, I speak with no accent. I do sometimes, especially when I get tired, to say weird things because my brain literally translates from one language to another.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would come here and I would say to offer a gift, because in French you offer gifts as
Mm-hmm.
give a gift. And I use some British expressions such as to cue or a boot, or to talk about the trunk of a car.
Right.
I as my mom would point out to me, I articulated far more before I moved to the States and was easier to understand, apparently. But the big thing was just habits. I remember, they're I went to Duke University for undergraduate, and I remember being handed a leaflet about things that were okay to discuss in America and things that weren't okay to discuss,
Mm.
or the notion of small talk and how important it is to the social interactions in the US. I remember being asked my very, very first night, feeling very homesick and alone, if it's true that French people were really rude and they didn't shave and they smelled bad. And my response to the young woman who asked me that question was, well, far less rude than you're being right now. The women wax. And yeah, sometimes a second shower would work well.
Yeah.
So getting in the habit of kind of figuring out simple things that make sense to people in America, like in dorm room experiences, one thing that makes sense in America is you leave your dorm room open. And so as people walk down the hallway, they might walk in, pop their head. I didn't understand those things. It was my bedroom door. I closed it, which also meant that it was harder to make friends because I didn't understand the social patterns. Interestingly enough, nowadays in the work I do, I spend a lot of time teaching people how to build relationships, make connections, relate to other people in the American culture. And sometimes I get to work with people who are working for large American corporations or have moved to branches of their corporations in the US and are really struggling with that disconnect between the way things are done in their cultures or their country and the way things are done here.
Well, when you went to Duke, did you learn to play basketball? Because that's a rule in North Carolina, of course.
Well, here's the thing. I had no idea what Duke basketball was about. None. I didn't get why it was a big deal. I also remember walking around and telling my mother, why are these people walking around wearing shirts and baseball caps that say Duke? We know you're here. Like, it's good. You're okay. Like, all those things that seem so, again, commonplace, things we do not think about because they're part of our lived experience. to me were so awkward. So no, I did not learn how to play basketball. Went to the UNC campus, I think on my second weekend, totally made friends with a bunch of Tar Heels. I broke all the rules. It was a
Well, yeah.
massive failure in some ways.
There is relevance in communicating, though. I went to speak in North Carolina, and I will also say if anybody needs a speaker, I'd love to talk with you about speaking. Having been in the World Trade Center and all the things that I've done, it's fun, and I'd love to travel abroad again as well. But I went to North Carolina, to do a speech several years ago, and Duke, UNC, and NC State were all poised to make it into March Madness, except that NC State and UNC had a game the Thursday night I arrived, and I expected just to be able to watch some television and turn on the TV only to hear the announcer say, shows are not going to be on tonight because of the game. Went, okay. And I've been in Kentucky when the Wildcats were actually not only in March Madness, but it was the final game, and they were one of the two teams in the final game. And I was doing a speech somewhere and was told, we have to end this entire event at 6:30. If you go beyond by 1 minute, you will be speaking to an empty gym. And we ended it on time. And sure enough, by 6:31, there were only about 2 or 3 people in the gym, and one of them was me, and the other person was the person who was going to take me back to my hotel. Amazing.
It is, if we bring it back to like this larger concept for people who might be listening, who don't get it or understand it, it really comes down to when you walk into a space, do you understand what the people around you are about? What's important to them? Like what defines their culture, and can you adapt to it? And I could absolutely and totally see what you're talking about happening, where people are like, there's going to be nobody here.
Yeah. And there wasn't. It was, I have never seen a gym clear out like that. And it wasn't even an emergency, but they were all gone. But it is interesting that, as you point out, and around this country, there are a lot of different cultures. Mm-hmm. Living in, and I've been in Massachusetts and lived there for 3 years, and I've lived in other places as well, in New Jersey. And the cultures are so different in a lot of ways than here in California. And at the same time, unless you experience a number of those different cultures, you don't tend to get a flavor for or get some sort of depth of knowledge to be able to understand how to adapt. I, for example, met a person in New Jersey who lived within 20 miles of New York City. This was a grown woman in her 50s and had never been to New York City. She had never really been out of Springfield, New Jersey, and in the surrounding areas, but had never been to New York City. Just wasn't even a priority to travel 20 miles.
That I cannot. That does not compute for me. I mean, I know people like that. I have very good friends in San Diego who are born and raised here, and we talk about the love for travel. Like if they travel to go see friends in Oregon. And that's about it. And there's no curiosity, and I don't judge them for that. It just does not compute.
No. Yeah, it's not a judgment issue at all. Whereas my wife, who was married to me for 40 years, she passed away last year, which is sad, but I've got 40 years of marriage, and I know she's monitoring. So if I'm ever not a good kid, I'm going to hear about it. So it works out. But the thing is that she had no fear of driving when we were in New Jersey into New York. And she drove all around California when we needed to go and do different things and all that, and loved to see different places. And so I always grew up with that kind of attitude. And so it helped me when I went to different places and went to places like West Virginia and experienced the foods that they have there, which are significantly different than in California, and just all the different things. It's, I think, important that we find ways to broaden our horizons and at least learn to respect those environments that are different than ours.
I agree. I mean, on so many levels, right? To go back to some of the things we were talking about, I was reading articles this week about the risk of loss of the ability for people to have civil discourse. And I
Yeah.
was reading an article about that very specifically in the workplace, that it's this huge potential risk for workplace initiatives, for innovation, for companies to be able to work together, also for companies to be able to access like a broad spectrum of talent, because if people now only start working in companies where there's a one-to-one alignment on culture and values, and then we lose that diversity
Yeah.
of that creation. So that it's a big kind of space that people need to start thinking about in 2021. But part of what it takes to be able to move the way I did as a child, or even in the States. So I moved to North Carolina, very different from Paris, France, in so many ways, but took the time to travel up and down the coast as many times, then left North Carolina, moved to Texas, to Dallas for graduate school. And as I was reminded day 3 in Texas, when I asked for a sweet tea, I was like, they told me, honey, this is not the South, it's the Southwest. I'm like, okay, right?
Okay.
Very different set of cultural norms, very different set of habits for people who aren't, who haven't lived in both of those places. They might just lump everything together.
Yeah.
I lived in Boston. I've spent enough time in New York City. I've been now in Southern California, moving to Southern California. I don't know how things are in Victorville, but in San Diego, there's this thing that I later learned was called the SoCal Flake. So for
Mm-hmm.
anybody moving to Southern California, so let's take LA County all the way south. If you have plans with somebody and they cancel on you about 10 minutes before you were due to meet because they're tired and they just decide they'd stay home, it's not you, it's them.
Yeah.
But that is a typical culturally acceptable thing to do here. And I would, first of all, when I moved, I found it very difficult. But when I was still practicing as a psychologist, and I would talk to people who moved here and felt very isolated, very alone, I often brought that up. And the sense of relief, they just didn't understand why it was so difficult to meet people, why people were so inconsistent or flaky, thus the name SoCal Flake. And to just explain, like, that is just like your plans need to always be very agile and ready to switch. These are just habits. So that ability to adapt, and the ability to have distress tolerance, right? Which is
My
really what we're supposed to learn when we're toddlers. Distress tolerance
yeah.
becomes essential.
My in-laws spent a significant amount of their lives in California. Um, my father-in-law was born in Canada, but moved here fairly young. My mother-in-law grew up in Arizona, but they really spent most of their time from maybe late 20s on in California. So they also went the other way. They would decide on a Saturday or a Sunday or whatever, let's have a party. And they had a whole bunch of people who were friends, what they call the instant party group. And all they had to do was call and everybody'd show up.
Love it.
No plans, just showed up. And
Mm-hmm.
people would bring things or not, and it didn't matter. But yeah, but the whole environment is definitely different than the structured environment of, say, the East Coast,
Mm-hmm.
where things are expected to be a certain way. And that's just the way it is. And it's okay. But we need
Yes.
to learn to tolerate it and understand it. And as you pointed out, this whole concept of social discourse and um, in the workplace and elsewhere, we're losing the art of conversing because there are so many people who don't necessarily think the way we do. And unfortunately, there are some people who have led so many people down that path of saying, well, if you don't think the way I do, then you can't be good.
It's, my opinion is that there's a tendency to take a lot of it very personally, that if somebody doesn't agree with you on something, that it's personal, it's about you, and it isn't. And a
Yeah.
lot of the work, a lot of I do a lot of work around mastering difficult conversations. I work with people in high stakes situations, right? So they're often big personalities. And because I work with women, sometimes they know how to stand and tall and big in front of those personalities, and other times it feels very unfamiliar and counterculture. And a lot of it is learning how to calm yourself down, how to recognize what you are thinking, recognize what's triggering you, and making sense of whether the things that are triggering you pertain to the situation that's in front of you, or it's like your own history, it's your own baggage. That's where there's a massive crossover between what I used to do as a clinical psychologist and then the work I do now.
One of the things that people just don't do nearly enough, though, is to, and in a nice way and in a curious way, ask questions.
Yep.
We are afraid, and I think we're taught that. I see it all the time as I am somewhere, and a child will want to know about my dog, and they'll say to their parents, "I want to go pet the dog," or they'll come up and say something to me, and the parents will go, "Don't talk to that man. He may not want to talk to you. Don't talk to that dog. It might bite." And I will stop no matter what I'm doing when some of that happens, especially dealing with the dog. And I'll take the dog's harness off and say, absolutely, the dog won't bite. Come on over and visit. And the reality is the dog loves it even more than the child, no matter what child it is, because they love the chance to take a break and get attention. But people are just taught how not to ask questions and how not to be curious, which is so sad.
Yeah, because they don't get practice on how to frame a question.
Yeah.
And I understand the impulse of the parents. I think a lot of time the impulse is we don't want to make somebody feel different or feel bad. Certainly, having done a lot of work in DEI, there's that idea of you think you're the first person to ask the question. That's the 20th time this person has had to field this question that day.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, if the questions are never asked, if the answers are never given, then nothing gets normalized. Then people stand out as outliers because I have to stare at them and try to make a story in my head, and now I'm staring at somebody instead of asking them. Living in San Diego, we have a lot of wounded warriors, right?
Yeah.
I would always tell my kids when they would ask, what do you think happened to that person's legs or their arms or whatever? I said, listen, if you really, really, really want to know, you can respectfully ask them, would it be okay if I asked you a question? And they're not idiots. They know exactly what the question is
Yeah.
likely to pertain to. And then they have the right to say, no, I'm tired, I'm sorry, I'm busy, whatever, and blow you off. Or you can simply ask. But what I don't want you doing is that like whispering, pointing,
Mm-hmm.
like without like either you're truly curious, ask, and with children you get away with that a lot more, especially if they're cute and polite. Um, or you're not curious enough to ask, in which case then walk on by and go on and go like live your life and do your day, but don't sit and stare at somebody and like whisper behind their back. That's humanly, evolutionarily, that's an incredibly uncomfortable position to be placed in as a human.
The media is what the media is, but I have to say, for me, and I've said it before on this podcast, after September 11th, I made the choice to allow the media to come and interview me. And I've been literally brought before cameras and had hundreds of interviews. And I've been asked the dumbest questions in the world up to the most intelligent and smartest questions in the world. And I will not say, even today, there is not a question that hasn't been asked, because every so often I'm surprised somebody will come up with a new question that makes me think. But I made the choice to do that, and it has been such a blessing to have all of that, because it actually was great therapy for me, because it made me talk about September 11th and all that was involved with that. But at the same time, it was a way to really get into discussions and then learn how to frame responses. And the more times people wanted to interview me, the more I had to learn to deal with it, and did learn to deal with it, to the point where it got to, I wouldn't say be automatic to answer questions, but I was always open to answering questions, because the other part about it for me was being blind and different than 99.95% of the population. I figured that I needed to be a teacher. So I very rarely would refuse to answer a question. because if I didn't, the odds are they wouldn't get the question answered. And usually questions came as I understood them from misconceptions about what blind people could and couldn't do and what eyesight was and what eyesight wasn't. So it was important to answer questions, and I really enjoy doing it.
So I'm really curious. I have two questions for you.
Do you?
Yeah. If you feel free not to answer them if you don't want to. So I'll give them both and you can answer them both or in any order. So one of the questions is I have to ask. I mean, you said I've been asked some of the stupidest questions. So I'm really curious what the stupidest question you've ever been asked is. And then the other question I have, because again, this is something I've worked on myself. This is something I work with other people. It's there's an art to being able to answer things on the fly or process information on the fly, especially in high stress or demanding environments. And so I'm wondering if you have any tips on how to do that.
Well, I'll answer that one first just because you asked it second and we're talking about it. It's just practice. For me, a lot of times I had to, when people ask questions in interviews, sometimes I had to stop and think about how to answer and what to answer because I hadn't been asked a particular question before. But the more I practiced at it and the more I answered, the easier it became to think of doing things on the fly. And I'll tell you another on the fly story in a moment. But to go back to your first question, so the reason that I got very exposed in the media was that Guide Dogs for the Blind on the 12th, I called and told them what had happened, Guide Dogs for the Blind up in San Rafael, because that's where I've gotten all of my guide dogs. And some of the people from there had visited me in the World Trade Center. So my wife reminded me that somebody was going to remember that at some point. So I called, and anyway, they put out a story, and it was clear what happened, right? I was in the World Trade Center. I got out. I worked in the World Trade Center. It was reported I was the Mid-Atlantic region sales manager for a computer company, a Fortune 500 company, and other things. You can't imagine the number of times that people would still say to me, "What were you doing in the World Trade Center anyway?" Hello, don't you read?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the other thing was they would say, "Well, did you know what happened?" And I said, "No, not until later." "Well, of course you didn't. You couldn't see it." And so my stock response to that is the last time I checked, Superman and X-ray vision were fiction. And the reality is I was on the south side of Tower 1 when it was struck on the north side, 18 floors above me. No one going down the stairs where I was had any clue what happened. Eyesight had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And it is so difficult to get people to recognize that because they really don't understand that disability is not a lack of ability. And I know you mentioned DEI earlier, but if you ask the average expert in diversity and so on about what diversity means, they'll talk to you about race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, and will not mention disabilities, which is so unfortunate. We're not part of the conversation. And that just bleeds over into almost everything. But the fact of the matter is, as I love to tell people, sighted people have disabilities too. Your biggest disability is you're light dependent. And you can't do a lick if suddenly the power goes out and you lose all your lights until you can find a light source. Thomas Edison fixed that for you guys originally. But the reality is that light dependence is just as much a disability as light independence. The only difference is that we are so technologically advanced in terms of providing light sources that your disability gets covered up so often because you can turn on a flashlight or a smartphone, or we have lights everywhere. It doesn't change the fact that the disability is there. And I don't mean any of that in a sarcastic or negative way, but I'm using that tool to try to start to get people to understand that disability isn't what you think it is. Of course, some diversity people say, well, disability doesn't mean a lack of ability because it starts with dis. And I say, yeah. And tell me what it is about the word discrete that makes it negative. You know, there's a dis in discrete. Tell me about that, and they can't, because the reality is that it has nothing to do with disability is a characteristic, and it manifests itself in so many different ways. And very frankly, I've learned a lot of that by articulating it on various episodes of Unstoppable Mindset. So some people are probably getting bored with me saying it all the time, but it is still true that we need to recognize that everyone has differences. It doesn't make any of us less than anyone else.
I think about this, you're right. The majority of conversations that take place around DEI have to do with race and gender. Let's just start there, right?
Yeah.
The majority of my conversations have to do with those two things, or the intersection of those two things. And there's a lot of conversation that is starting to take place around like neurocognitive
Mm-hmm.
differences, right? And when I talk with people who, for example, have pretty bad ADHD, often present it like it's this really bad thing. I'm like, hold on, because as somebody who has ADD, ADHD, what I will say is it a disadvantage when I have to remember numbers? Absolutely. Terrible person, cannot argue with my husband and win an argument. The man can watch a movie, quote the whole movie, remember. Literally, he will say, "You remember we met at college?" So I'll say, "You remember that night we were playing spades, and so you played this card, this person played," and he'll go through the whole thing, like everybody's hands. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
What was on TV and was I eating pickles? Like that might help me place the night. Who was there? Right. I'm a Gestalt person. I remember like broad strokes, themes. But where it becomes an incredible advantage is in coming up with solutions, because the
Mm-hmm.
brain constantly, like I call it, I say, it's these star blasts. Like a thought comes and you have 10 other thoughts that spring from it, and then 10 others and 10 others and 10 others. If you can rein that in, if you can gain some control over that, it's a huge advantage. You talked about sightedness, right? And the advantage of being able to work in spaces with low light as somebody who's entering middle age, or who's fully middle aged and whose eyesight went from perfect to me wondering why people ever thought that 6-point font was a reasonable font for any kind of label, and being very dependent suddenly on readers,
Mm-hmm.
especially in low light, right? Looking at having to figure out the world in different ways becomes interestingly challenging. So there is this advantage. It's about looking at, and that's growth mindset among other things, right? It's about being able to look at where is there an opportunity here, as opposed to just thinking different equals bad.
Yeah. It is something that we need to do. And again, I submit it still all goes back to curiosity. The more curious we are, and the more curious we allow ourselves to be, the more we will open ourselves to being able to learn. And it is just the thing that we're not taught to do from an early age.
Mm-hmm.
So when you went to Duke, what did you major in?
Psychology.
Ah, of course you did.
I started off, I was an avid reader of Pat Conroy. And if
Okay.
you ever read any Pat Conroy, his stories are all about people being incredibly twisted and broken, and in one way or another, and
Yeah.
difficult family dynamics. One of the books I read was The Prince of Tides.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to add to this contextual story. I was born because my older sister, 2 at the time, drowned and died. It was
Mm-hmm.
not planned. Neither of my parents were not planning on having a kid. Actually, it would have been impossible if not for the fact that my mother's obstetrician told her, when she went to get her tubes tied the year before, wait a year. And if in a year you still want this, we'll do it. And in that year, my sister died. So I came into a family with a lot of psychological, just the trauma from all of that. So sometime as a young teenager, I decided I want to be a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was the decision. I am going to be a psychologist, and I had it all planned out what my career was going to be like. So I majored in psychology. I specialized as a child psychologist. I went directly to graduate school for clinical psychology, specialized in child psychology.
Where did you go?
The University of Texas
University of
Southwestern
Texas.
Medical
Okay.
Center in Dallas. It's a
Okay.
mouthful, but it
Yeah.
is. And then came to came here to San Diego because my husband got matched for residency with UCSD, and same thing, went directly, got a postdoc and as a child psychologist, opened a practice as a child psychologist, had my kids. And then I thought, oh, all the stuff that was fun about interacting with kids all day long, every day, suddenly was not as much fun when I had to go back home and interact with kids all day. So moved to working with adults, very specifically in anxiety, stress, what would be called burnout nowadays.
Yeah.
Didn't have that name back then, perfectionism, and then did that for a few years and fell out of love with it. And then looked at what I did love about being a therapist and the people I really enjoyed working with. And fast forward a decade, I am where I am now.
So how did you come up with the name Noteworthy?
My mission for my company, for what I do professionally, was to build a world where women could access the highest levels of leadership and power at such a regular level that it was no longer noteworthy.
Mm,
Right. So
got
right
it.
now it's very noteworthy, right? We'll say so and so, the first, the second CEO, female CEO of Pepsi, the first whatever. We haven't had a first female president. I don't think we'll have one for a very long time, right? Those kinds of things. I just want to get to a place where we can just say so and so CEO of,
Yeah.
president of.
Yeah.
And when I rebuilt my website, I showed it to two friends who are part of my board of advisors, my personal board of advisors, and I said maybe I should come up with a new name. The company's name is Life and Focus Coaching, right? Because that I started as a life coaching business, was my first transition. And one said, "Why don't you do Noteworthy?" She's like, "It is in your mission. That is
There
what
you
you're trying."
go.
The women right now are still very noteworthy, so that's that's a story. I just need to get some of my clients to say not worthy, and I'm like, no, not worthy, noteworthy. You are worthy.
Yeah. So Noteworthy certainly is, I think, a cool title. And I'm glad that you're doing it. So tell me a little bit more about exactly what you do and why you do it.
These days, I spend my time. I'm really lucky. We just had a holiday dinner with my San Diego clients. I work with women all around the world, but because I'm San Diego based, I have a large contingency of current and former San Diego clients. And towards the end of dinner, when most of them were gone, because I cannot do a speech about something that moves me without tearing up, and I'm like, I just don't want to cry again. I looked down at the table. There were about 5 women left, and I said, I just need you all to know that you are my dream come true. Right? Which is true.
Mm,
I am very privileged to get to work with women who I genuinely believe are extraordinary. I do believe they're noteworthy in their own right, whether they feel that way or not. And they tend to be, by design, for what I'm trying to achieve for them, women who are executives, usually VP to the C-suite. And these are women who have a track record of excellence. They're at the top of their game, but the cost, the price to pay, the effort that they've had to put forth in order to reach where they are in their careers tends historically to have been much higher than their male counterparts. That's just a fact. It's not a judgment. It's just a fact. And so when they show up in these situations, there's some habits that need to be broken. The habit of raising your hand to do all the things you can do versus positioning yourself to do what you do best, and building your brand and your reputation around your top value. Knowing how to set boundaries without feeling guilty. A lot of the women I work with have fantastic titles, but they don't always feel, or sometimes it's not about feeling, it is the reality. They don't always have the authority that they need with those titles to be able to lead very effectively or with impact. So that's the work we do with these women. And I get to leverage all the things I love about being a psychologist, so building trust, getting deep, understanding what holds people back internally, and breaking down those barriers, plus all the behavioral, like everything I learned about being a psychologist working with children and teaching parents how to parent effectively conditioned behavior, all of that gets applied to these workplace interactions. So I do that with individual women, and then more and more we're getting opportunities to also work with companies and come into companies and either help them support and elevate individual women or build programs that will allow the women that they have on staff to show up much more effectively, to be really successful, which is great for the company and tends to drive retention. It is a dream come true, because I'm one of the few privileged people that I know of who, when she was really miserable with her job, just got to rewrite kind of how she wanted to work and what she wanted to do. So that is what I do.
So, in working with women and so on, where can or do men get involved in the equation at all?
They get involved in a couple places. A lot of the work I do around, actually, I head a committee, I co-founded a committee, is around male allyship. So simply helping good men understand why the experience is different for women, and helping them understand how to position themselves actively so that they can be the men they think they are when it comes to supporting folks, in this case women, but I often make the case, I'm like, whatever I'm talking about that
Yeah.
has to do with gender, it has to do with anybody and everybody. These are just
Yeah.
human dynamics. So men have this like really great opportunity to kind of take off blinders and see situations for what they are and intervene in a couple of capacities. One capacity is simply sometimes to call out things that they see that have been normalized, because as women, when we call them out, we're labeled as hysterical or emotional or too sensitive or bra burners or whatever. Just, another great way for men to step in is by using sponsorship, really sitting there and opening doors. That's literally what sponsorship is. It's what we all do. You know somebody, you like them, you know that they do a good job, like you recommend them to other people. That's what sponsorship is all about. So being able to do that, having conversations with other men about stuff, right? This is where men can really play an incredibly powerful role. So we run trainings for male allies, which are fun. It's a 5-part training, and we don't start talking to them about techniques until we talk to them about, go talk to a bunch of women and get their perspective. And then we'll come back and they'll say, I didn't realize, like, I never thought about the fact that when I leave on a business trip, I just need to like take one pair of shoes plus my comfortable tennis shoes and think about this, but she needs an extra 30 minutes to get ready because there's an expectation that she's going to look a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about roadblocks, all the reason why men, despite having the best of intentions, despite like morally really being like solid human beings, might not take action. And again, these are human patterns. They don't just pertain to gender, but things like being afraid of screwing up. What if I'm trying to help and I say or do something that's wrong and I make things worse? Or being afraid to step in and do something nice for somebody who doesn't want your help. And my guess is that comes up a lot when we talk about ableism, right? Or people, somebody who might try to open the door for somebody or help somebody or give their seat, and another person, I don't need you to do this, I don't need your help, right? And so that's another fear. And of course, the third one is, what if I stand up and speak up, and because of that, I lose my status? I get told I'm all these things, too sensitive, too woke, and then I start losing opportunities. And to men in general, I'll say, those are all good things to be afraid of. They will all happen. Like every single one of them. You will put your foot in your mouth. You will make a mistake in trying to do something helpful. You will screw it up. You will one day try to help somebody who's going to look at you and be pissed off that you tried to help them because they didn't need your help. And you will get called out by somebody somewhere. And at the end of the day, you'll survive. Like you will just be fine. It's uncomfortable. And that's just the price of showing up for people. It's uncomfortable sometimes.
It gets back to what we talked about earlier. How much of that, and the answer is, I'm sure, a lot. How much of that is learned behavior?
I mean, I think most of it is learned
Yeah.
behavior. And I actually will say this. I think most of the non-action is learned behavior. You ever watch little kids? I mean, children by definition are humans by definition are egocentric, and children are like the the ultimate egocentric like stage of human beings. They're completely focused on their world and what's happening. But kids are, we talked about this, like relatively curious. When you
Hmm.
teach them basic manners, it comes kind of naturally to them to open up doors, to help, to do things. We teach people to be afraid. We teach
Hmm.
people to worry about making mistakes. We teach people to like stay in your lane, just stay in your lane, right? And then that gets carried like to our adult selves and our adult behaviors.
Yeah. And that's, of course, the issue. We don't learn to be more open. We don't learn to be more curious, and we don't learn to be willing to step out or step back and then step out and explore.
Mhm. And these same things that I teach men, by the way, I teach women to do for other women. And I teach women to do for other people, period. I am very selective. And one thing about all my clients is they have to be the kind of women who will lift others while climbing. They cannot be women who are going to get to the top and are going to guard their place and are going to put other people through the same hazing, through the same like hurdles that they face just because, well, I had to.
Hmm.
So this is a skill set to teach. It's just about being a good human. I really like ultimately it's what it comes down to.
What's the most important skill you think that a woman should learn as they're working and advancing and integrating in society?
I will say that data shows that the most important skill a woman needs to learn for advancement is visibility, like how to build visibility.
Mm,
But what it comes down to, if we tap into like my experience as a psychologist, what it comes down to is the ability to recognize and own what your true value is.
mhm.
Right. And that's such a gift. Once you do that for yourself as a woman in the workplace, first of all, yes, you can build visibility because you can speak about what you bring to the table. You can articulate how that skill set can really drive impact in certain spaces. You can start building like your reputation as an expert or your expertise in a field. Like all of those things are really good. But the back end of that is also it's about owning it. It's about walking into the world and being clear about what you have to add to the conversation into the space and to do that without false humility or a sense of shame. And for a lot of women and a lot of girls, we are taught to not do that. Little girls from the time they're in sandboxes, I would say, are taught to be collaborative and be helpful and share and give, but to their own detriment.
Yeah.
So I've worked with women all around the world and on every single continent, every single basic general culture, larger culture. Every woman tells me, well, in my culture, in my family, it's not acceptable to speak about myself. It's not acceptable to say I'm really good at this. It's not acceptable to say, well, part of the reason we won that game, part of the reason we moved the needle forward on this project was because I was able to dot dot dot. But if as women we learn to do this, not only will it benefit us, but it actually benefits the people we work with and for. Because by being very clear about what our top skills are and how best to leverage them, what we're actually communicating to people is how we can help them and the best way to help them.
And the reality is sometimes to break in as being a part of a team is to really be willing to say, not in an egotistical way, but to say what skills you bring and why you're a valuable part of the team.
Yep. I was just having a conversation with a client of mine who's a returning client, and she recently got a promotion, which is why she came back. And she's suddenly working on, and we talked about, and like her team is all pros, meaning they're like the top of the top. And initially she's like, well, I don't even know what I bring to the conversation. They're all so autonomous. I said, we need to go back to the basics. What is it that you do really well? How can that skill set support
Yeah.
support them, and how can you position that and rethink about what your value is to this team and communicate it to them so that you can support them, which she's done very well in 6 months. And she's just onboarding a new team member. She said, what should I do to help him integrate better? And I said, ask him the same questions. What does he love doing that he's really good at?
Mm-hmm.
How does he want those skills leveraged? Where can he make the greatest impact? How does that fit in your team? Communicate that. We build this sense of togetherness.
Those kinds of questions will tell her more about the person she's talking with than most anything else she could do.
Mm-hmm. And time again, it pays off.
Of course it does, as it should. So is there a book in you? Have you written a book? Are you thinking about it?
Oh my goodness. I have co-authored chapters in many books. There is a book in me. I want to write a book that will be called Now You See Me, about this idea of visibility and everything that goes into it. I don't know when I'm going to have the time to do this. Isn't that every would-be wannabe author's excuse? If you talk to my very first coach who I hired in 2018, he would tell you, Alessandra's been saying, I've been telling her to write a book since 2018. It's going to be 2024. I don't know. It'll happen.
You got it. You just have to decide that that's the priority and take the time to do it.
That is true.
And it will happen at the right time.
If it matters enough, it will.
If it matters to you or to whoever, you'll make it happen. Well, this has been fun, and I really have enjoyed doing it. I know you've got children to go pick up, so I don't want to make you too late for that. So I want to thank you again for being with us and doing this episode with us. I appreciate it.
Michael, thank you. It's a delightful way to end the year. So I have very, very much enjoyed our conversation.
Well, this has been fun. We'll have to do another one. And we don't even need to wait till you have a book. But good. I want to thank you. I want to thank you all for listening to us on Unstoppable Mindset. Please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. And please transmit your opinions, your views, your thoughts. Alessandra would like to know, and I would love to know what you think. So feel free to do that. If people want to reach out to you and possibly work with you or use you as a coach, how do they do that?
There are 2 great places to find me. One is the website, which is noteworthyinc.co. So noteworthyinc.co. And then the other one is LinkedIn. So I'm there under Dr. Alessandra Wal. But those are best places to reach me.
And Alessandra is Alessandra.
Yep. And Wal is like the Pink Floyd album. W-A-L, simple.
W-A-L. Well, thanks again to all of you for listening. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And Michael Hingson is MICHAELHINGSON. Love to hear from you. Really appreciate your thoughts. And Alessandra, for you and for everyone listening, if you know of anyone who might be a good podcast guest or you'd like to suggest anyone, please reach out. Always looking for folks. And since we've both mentioned it, Alessandra and I are speakers. We are always looking for speaking opportunities. She wants to go to the Middle East. I'll go there, but I want to make sure it's a little bit more peaceful when I go. But I'd love to speak. So if anybody knows of any speaking opportunities, let us both know, right?
Yep, please.
There we go.
Love speaking.
We appreciate it. So again, Alessandra, for you one more time, thank you very much. This has been fun.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.